Hello, everybody. My name is Eric Trexler. I am the one and only host of Iron Culture presented by Mass. Ever the coward, Eric Helms neglected to show up tonight. That was scheduled in advance, and honestly, I'm not complaining about it. I'm joined tonight by the esteemed Jake Remmert, who is a doctoral student studying in the lab of our good friend and Mass colleague, Dr. Mike Zordos. And we are very lucky to have Jake here because he's going to tell us all about a brand new meta-regression paper, part of a series of meta-regression papers. In the past, we've talked about others in this series that have looked at a variety of training variables and how they impact both strength and hypertrophy. And in this case, we've got this new one that just hit the preprint servers only a matter of days ago. And it's already generating some buzz on the internet. And this one's all about per session set volume. So if you've ever wondered, after that third set, is it time to cut it or do more or move to another exercise for the same muscle group? All the debates about how much volume is adequate, when are you in junk volume territory? I'm sure we're going to get to all that and more. Before I get into introductions and all that stuff, Jake, you're waiting so patiently. I appreciate that. I'm intimidated. We see the bodybuilding trophies and diplomas just all over the place behind Jake. He means business. But before we get to introductions, I got to do the business stuff. So everyone, if you like the show, make sure you support it. A lot of ways to do it. First of all, easiest, make sure you like this video. Make sure you subscribe to the channel, subscribe to the podcast feed, all that stuff. Share it with a friend. Send the link everywhere. Spam it to your relatives, whatever you got to do. If you want to really support us big time, you could subscribe to the Mass Research Review, become a member of the Mass community. A lot of good folks in there learning every single month. The first of the month, we put out a new publication with articles, videos, audio files talking about the newest and most useful research related to your health and fitness goals. And if you want, for the first time ever, to see the entire Mass crew in person. Now, as we've mentioned before, there are members of the Mass crew, a slim crew, only 4 of us, who have never met each other in person. For the first time in the history of Mass, going all the way back to 2017, every active member of the Mass Research Review team will be in the same location, and you can be there too. We're going to be in Austin, Texas for our conference April 12th and 13th. And if you want to join virtually, there's an option to do that. You can learn all about it through the Sports Nutrition Association's website. I'll see if I can put a link in the show notes eventually. Okay, Jake, all that out of the way. First and foremost, how you doing tonight?
I'm doing great. I gotta say this first and foremost, just like you said, to get it out of the way. Thank you so much for having me. I told you before we started, I've been a listener for literally since the inception of both of these things, of Iron Culture, since you guys, since the Derek days, and also with Matt. Like I remember, it sort of coincided with me starting, going back to undergrad after some time between high school and college. And I would go every single day. I'd go walk to the library because my laptop sucked, and get on the public computers and read religiously. I read every single thing that was published in every article. So this is cool. Thank you for having me.
Well, we appreciate that very much, and welcome to the show. Honestly, we were talking about this before we hit record here, but I was really surprised that you haven't been on the show yet, and that's a massive error and oversight on our part, but very happy to have you tonight. Appreciate all the compliments about what we've been doing, and hopefully this will be the first appearance of many, right? So,
Hope so.
all right, Jake. So since it is your first time, let's do all the pleasantries and the formal introductions. So if people want to know why they should listen to you, again, aside from the fact that you are just overflowing your background with medals, I just see the medal now. So the medals, the trophies, the diplomas. So how did we get here, Jake? What brings you to studying strength in a hot, humid lab down in Florida?
Well, not the weather, I'll tell you that. My least favorite weather that I could possibly have. So, but yeah, I don't know. I just a little bit over 10 years ago, discovered the gym and just got swept up in it. And I was going through all the, as you do, searching through social media to find people who were jacked to follow, and because they had to know what was right. Um, and very fortunately stumbled upon Lane Norton almost immediately, and found out there's a whole evidence-based side to this thing. And I was like, wow, how cool is this? And I didn't know what I wanted to do with my life. And eventually I was like, man, people do this online coaching thing. How can I do that? How can I stand out? I'll go get a PhD. Right. So
Yeah.
that's what my brain did. But here we are, right? Almost 10 years later, and it's just about working out. So that's really how it started, as silly as that sounds. And
Yeah.
just started consuming whatever I could, and obviously was ecstatic when you guys started Mass and when I found all the, 3DMJ and obviously Iron Culture, just everything, all the stuff that all of you guys and more have done has just been so amazing. And I'm really grateful now to be in a position where I can start to give back to that community through being part of research, or doing my own, coaching, science communication thing, whatever you want to call it. Um, yeah, that's sort of how I got here. I just sort of fell into it and ran with it, I guess.
Awesome. And I must say, people are going to probably comment if they're watching on YouTube, my general lack of grace as you're heaping all these compliments on iron culture and mass and things. It's hard out here, folks. Being the producer slash host, I'm twisting all sorts of knobs. I'm checking audio levels. So cut me some slack. Give me some grace. I am humbled by all the kind words. And I have to say, it sounds very much like my own kind of entry point into this stuff. I remember, ironically enough, actually messaging Lane, the very same Lane Norton, maybe in like 2011, and asking him what should I do if I'm into this stuff. Because you gotta understand, like, and you probably know this. I don't know when you officially plugged into this world, but if you go back to like 2011, there was like, basically think of every bodybuilding case study that comes to mind. None of them were out yet. That whole wave of like bodybuilding case studies and those little case series and these small pilot studies with little bodybuilding cohorts, the bodybuilding literature basically died in the mid 90s and was just gone until it kind of revived in like 2013ish. All these, like, nowadays, these like review papers talking about how to get jacked and kind of, how to do an off season for a bodybuilder, how to do contest prep weight loss for a bodybuilder, how to, all these big review papers that start synthesizing data and put it all together. Those don't exist in 2011. There was this kind of big change where, starting in like about 2010ish, you start to see more of these really applied papers saying like, hey, what's the deal with supersets? It's starting to finally look into some of these things that were just like, they just lived in the bodybuilding magazines, which I totally came up on. Like, that's when I first got into lifting. My wrestling coach pulled me aside and said, we're not doing the team workouts, we're doing these special workouts. And we were just going through Muscle and Fitness magazine with Jim Stepani,
Yeah.
taking all the dumbest supplements in the world, but also doing some of these fun bodybuilding style workouts. But yeah, it's crazy to think, like, I hope that now people in that our shoes, have enough good resources out there that they can kind of see a clear path, and it's pretty straightforward of how you kind of merge your kind of practical enjoyment for this stuff with an educational angle to it. But man, back, when I was first getting into it, and probably when you were as well, it was it was a little bit harder to see that path, but I think it's a little clearer now for the young folks.
Yeah. Yeah, I think that was 20, when did I get really deep? It was probably like 2014,
Yeah.
2015.
So
Um,
right when that stuff, just a few years after I was getting plugged into it, and that stuff was really starting to snowball.
yeah.
So okay, where'd you do your undergrad?
Illinois State.
Illinois State. Okay, and then masters and PhD are both at Florida Atlantic, right?
Yes, sir.
All right, good stuff. And when did I see all the trophies and medals? When did that stuff come into the picture? Actual competing.
That 5 months ago.
Oh, really?
So
Okay.
yeah, so we are It's been in the back of my head for a long time. I mean, when I lifted a little bit before this, like I lifted in high school and stuff, but it was inconsistent. Whatever. I had a couple years after high school where I didn't do anything at all for exercise, and then they're in like end of it was fall of 2014 is when I was like, let me actually let me do this, right? Let me actually try to do this thing, and started. I got sucked in immediately, and I was like, man, people, you can do competitions. Do I want to do that someday? Maybe. So it was always kind of there, and then I went down the powerlifting route for a while and did some meets, and that was super fun. But then eventually I had like a not horrible, but meaningful lower back injury that so I couldn't squat or deadlift for 6 months or whatever it ended
Yeah.
up being. And I was like, well, let me just, I don't know, I don't need to squat or deadlift to do bodybuilding. Let me try that. So that was really when I started, and that was the end of 2019, and I haven't really looked back since then. I keep saying I'll go
Nice.
back to powerlifting at some point, but I haven't yet.
Yeah.
But yeah, we just kind of roll with it and attempted a prep at the it would have been for spring 2020 shows, and those didn't work out for a reason I'm sure we can all guess. Um, so ended up I was 5 weeks out actually when everything got shut down. So
Ooh.
uh, but we got most of it, and it's about the journey
Yeah.
anyway for me, right? So I got most of what I came there for, but nonetheless, it was unfinished business. Got busy with school, all that stuff, and then here this past year, I was like, it's time, right? It's time to do this, and it's actually funny. I was coached by Ryan Doris, who I'm sure you know, and I'm sure a bunch of your listeners are aware of, and I worked with him for a long time when I was powerlifting, and we had taken a break from coaching there for a minute, and it was almost the exact same. It was like the same month that I was like, I'm committing to this. I want to do it this, and I want to get back with Ryan and whatever. He texted me and he was just like, bro, when are we doing this prep? Like, just like the stars aligned. So yeah, we made it happen. I ended up competing. I did 2 shows back in November. Um, one was here locally in South Florida, and then one I actually flew back home to Illinois, where my family was there. It was pretty much the 10-year exactly anniversary of me starting training seriously, so that was
Yeah.
cool. And yeah, it was a blast. Some of these are participation medals, right? But hey, I'll take them. And so I didn't like, you know, I didn't win a pro card by any means, but I'm
Yeah.
happy with how I did. I got second in the classes that I did and stuff, so like that's cool. I'll take that for the first time.
Yeah. Yeah, for sure. I mean, I yeah, your first competitive season, you know, a lot of it comes down to getting a feel for the process, enjoying it, hopefully having a good experience, you know, hitting a milestone where you go from being an enthusiast to a competitor. Like even just making that step is really big. And even if you do happen to take home larger amounts of hardware in your first competition, it's like you're so far from your best physique ever that it's completely irrelevant, right?
Yeah.
Like I won my first show. I won like the novice class, right? But you look back at it, and bodybuilding didn't have there wasn't as much talent in bodybuilding. Like I started doing bodybuilding and powerlifting before all the jacked and strong people got into it, and so you go back and you're like, yeah, I never lost. And then you just look at your numbers, especially in powerlifting, it's so obvious. You're like, oh my God, if I walked into just like
Yeah.
the smallest local competition today, I'd get my doors blown off.
Oh, dude. Yeah, it's
So yeah,
crazy.
it's completely circumstantial where the placings all line up. And man, I just remember, Columbus, Ohio, where I did my undergrad, had this wonderful gym culture. Still does, I believe. I don't know. I've been removed for a while. But, Columbus, you think within a pretty close proximity, you've got the Arnold Classic every year in the heart of downtown. You've got West Side Barbell. You've got Elite FTS. You've got Rogue. Like, the gym culture there is absolutely excellent. I'm sure I'm leaving off all sorts of big name, companies and people and things like that. But it was just it's where it was at for bodybuilding, powerlifting, and the adjacent kind of strength sports. But I remember a guy came into our gym and was just a freak of nature, like, and he had never competed. He was in his 40s, like mid to late 40s, and he goes and steps on stage in his first amateur show, and obviously cleans up. And then I think 2 weeks after his first show, where I think he actually did the novice class, he goes and takes second at Worlds, And so I'm like, some some poor bastard just went to their like first ever show novice class, and they literally could have had like the third best physique on the planet that day, and
Uh-huh.
they didn't win their damn show because this guy just like literally almost a world champion ready physique just rolls in and says, I'd like to try bodybuilding today. Like,
Uh,
man,
it's
what a
painful.
tough break for them, you know?
It's painful. Even more reason to not worry about the placing, right? Like
Yeah.
that was from day one. I like I'm trying to. Alberto said that a long time ago. Like the best thing is you learn stuff about yourself that would be undiscovered otherwise,
Yeah.
and that's always just stuck with me. And that's exactly what I got. And I'm happy I got the cool trophy also, right? But the without that, it's still super worth it, and I'm glad I did it. I can't wait to do it again. Not for a few years,
Yeah.
but yeah, it's a beautiful thing. It's hard, but it's a beautiful thing.
Absolutely. But all right, Jake, we did not bring you on here as much as we are interested. We did not bring you on to discuss your blossoming bodybuilding career. We want to get down to business here. So we in the past we've talked about, like I said, this kind of series of meta regressions coming out of the Zordos lab. So of course there was the one about what was it, set volume, right, through over the course of the week, right? So fractional set volume. There was also one about, was it training frequency?
Yep, the weekly volume and frequency were in the same
Those
paper.
were in the same one. There was
Yep.
another meta regression in this series that I'm blanking on, right? Which one was
The
that?
proximity to failure.
Yes, of course. Yeah, proximity to failure. Absolutely. And now we've got a new edition, and you are the lead author of this one. So you presumably, I'm certain, know the data better than anybody. And this one is all about set volume within a session. And this is obviously something that is always top of mind for a lot of lifters because this is really a variable that, in my opinion, if I can editorialize, really gives your program kind of one of its most uh, tangible characteristics that you really feel about a program, which is when I step into the gym, how much time am I spending in there? You know, how packed is this whole endeavor? And that's the one thing when people really start to feel like I'm putting so much into this. The one variable that I think really starts to tip that scale a little bit is just session or volume per session, which ultimately ends up telling you basically how many minutes are we spending in the gym here, So I don't want to do any more editorializing. I'd love to give you the floor here to kind of set up, set the scene and kind of give us a little bit of a quick summary of the methodological approach for, first of all, what was your research question, and then how did you go about addressing it?
Yeah, awesome. So yeah, the interesting thing to me about the per session volume stuff is like there's not much out there on it, right? Like there's a couple, like in the intro to the paper, like there's a couple studies that we could talk about, but there just wasn't a ton. Um, so we had to get a little creative, and that was part of the inclusion criteria process, whatever, of gathering the studies was looking at not just studies that are comparing two different volumes, but also studies comparing different frequencies. Because ultimately, that's the interaction that results in per session volume, right? You can have the same total weekly volume split into different frequencies, thus different per session volume. And we got to think about like, well, man, there's got to be a better and a worse way to do this, right? So how do we actually look at that? Was really the main thing, and that was sort of tied to my dissertation project as well. Not to tangent, but it's something that I'm really interested in for that anyway. So it kind of works nicely to do both of these. But yeah, that was really in very simple terms. The research question is people really haven't looked at this a whole lot, so it's interesting to do so just for the sake of it, but also we've seen this dose response relationship between total volume and hypertrophy and strength, and as you mentioned with frequency and proximity to failure. But what does the dose response relationship look like for per session volume? Is it the same? Is it different? Who knows, right? So that was in very simple terms what we set out to do, and we had to do a whole lot of, of screening. I think we wound up, it was like 67, I believe, included studies, which is what, like 1% or something of the ones that popped up from the initial search. So it's, I'll tell you what, Dr. Trexler, I have learned an awful lot about meta-analysis doing this process. But it's the best way to learn, I guess, is to jump in.
You know,
But yeah, so
if I could take a peek behind the curtain, I was a little
yeah,
curious about that. So, I've thrown my hat in the ring for a meta-analysis project or two. Definitely rolled up my sleeves and done some of that, study screening, data extraction, all that stuff. Now we've seen this kind of series of meta-regressions, this kind of three paper arc that's kind of come out of the lab. And one of the things I was curious about was, to what extent has that effort of study, screening, and extraction, was there ever a kind of initial phase where you just cast a wide net and tried to kind of gather everything for these three research questions, or has it been a truly independent process all three times?
yeah, so the proximity to failure one was independent. And then I was actually just about to get into that with the weekly volume and frequency and this per session one. It was the same. So if you read the two papers, you'll see the method sections are incredibly similar. The
Yeah.
statistical is almost the exact same. Um, so I mean, it really is the exact same. We just looked at a different independent variable, right? So
Right. Yeah.
the screening process, all of the extraction, all of that was done collectively. And then because it was just the sheer volume of stuff to talk about and analyze, it just made a lot more sense to split them. And and yeah, so that's how we wound up with the two big projects. And I'm so glad that we did split it because like it's hard enough to even talk about one of these things, let alone all of it at once. So
Right. Yeah.
yeah.
Yeah. Well, I'm glad to hear that because I was just thinking, if I had to do a really big, because this isn't like one of those things where you say, hey, I'm going to pick on one paper in particular that just I was reading through recently, but hey, we're going to look at the effects of betaine on body composition in humans, and so you get four studies, and and you throw them into a meta-analysis. You could do the extraction in between the two classes you're teaching on a Wednesday, right? But I mean, with these projects, it was so big. I was like, I hope that you guys kind of streamlined that and had a kind of plan ahead of time of how are we going to make this tolerable. Because if you guys went back to the well and started from scratch for three separate cracks at that process, I would feel like at that point you just got to give everyone a PhD and let them go out the door. Putting them through
Yeah,
that three times.
for sure. Or just kick us out for being dumb and not figuring out the smart way to do it.
Yeah, yeah,
you know.
good
But
point. All right, so given the fact that we've talked a little, well, we talked plenty on Iron Culture about the previous meta regression project. We were looking at set volume and training frequency, right? And so we've kind of gone through those methods, but how about just like a little quick refresher of kind of
yeah,
the approach that you guys took, and then we can get into the results, and then of course everyone's favorite is going to be the practical application.
cool. That's my favorite as well.
Yeah.
So, yeah. So I guess the TLDR on the methods would be we wanted to try to look at the question in the best way that we could. Meaning, like we wanted to cast a wide net, but not so wide that it's completely impractical. Like you could make an argument that every single resistance training study should be included, right?
Right.
Like it's a valid argument, but it's just impossible to do that. At least given the constraints of the timeline of the PhD and all that kind of stuff. So we did have to make some decisions, and you can see all the inclusion criteria if you read the paper. Off the top of my head, there was, we everything up until about 70 years of age, male or female was fine. Studies where they manipulated either volume or frequency or both. They had to control within a study between the groups or conditions that they're comparing. They had to control proximity to failure and rest times and those sorts of things. So it's as much of an apples to apples comparison as possible. There's a few other that I'm sure I'm overlooking, but you can see in the paper. So we have those inclusion exclusion criteria. Healthy subjects, another one. And then we had to decide, okay, we need to go through and extract all this data. How are we doing this? And what most or all of the previous meta-analyses have looked at sets in a certain way. And I know when you guys talked about the weekly paper, you guys got into this some, where, for example, a set of bench press would be one set of chest and one set for triceps. They counted it equally. Whereas what we did is we did that, but we also looked at just direct training. So, like for triceps, for example, not counting chest press for that, only counting tricep pushdowns, for example. Or fractional is the other one where we counted indirect sets as a half of a set. So we're trying to get at like this contributes to the movement some or to the muscle group some, but it's not like directly training it, right? So we quantified the volume in those three different ways and then extracted all the data for all three of those different volume quantification methods, and then went through the whole meta-analysis process that was very involved. I guess the multi-level meta-analysis, I guess, is the easiest way to say it, to help to account for some of those like nested effects, right? To make sure that we're actually comparing like the within study comparisons there. We're looking at those rather than just chucking everything in weighted equally and all that kind of stuff. But yeah, I guess that's the super quick and dirty version. We also did one extra thing for this, the per session paper, which was the question everybody wants is what is the point? What's the cap, right? That's what everyone's looking for. And that's what we were interested in also partially, right? We just wanted to know what the relationship was like. But, so we're fitting all these different statistical models and we're looking at it, the direct model, the fractional model, the total model. We're looking at all these different functional forms. There's like 6 or 7 different shapes that we were trying to see what fit the data the best and all this kind of stuff. And eventually we landed on what did seem to fit the best. And probably unsurprisingly, if you have listened to the episode about the weekly stuff, it was the fractional model for hypertrophy. Slightly surprisingly, it was the direct model for strength. So that was the one that was a little bit different. I'm sure we can talk about that a little bit. But anyway, so we have these curves and we wanted to figure out, well, what is this point? Everyone wants to call it the point of diminishing returns. That's what we were calling it a lot. We realized that's kind of misleading because it diminishes immediately. So we had to call it something else, and we came up with the very annoying title of point of undetectable outcome superiority, which is, I think, technically correct, but kind of a mouthful and awkward to say, but what are you going to do?
Yeah. So, what was the process of how did you settle on that particular set of terminology? Was that borrowed from another field, or was it borrowed from a different statistical concept? And you're like, well, it kind of fits here with a little tweaked name. Like, how did you settle on that?
Yeah, that was straight off the dome, to be honest. We
Really?
were brainstorming,
Okay.
and we were looking at like what are we actually trying. We ultimately had to dig into what are we actually defining, and so one of the things that we did in the methods was we wanted to define sort of the smallest detectable effect size, or what is the smallest change in the outcome that we can feel pretty confident isn't just error that you might expect in normal studies. If I remember correctly, that was around 2% for strength and around 4% for hypertrophy. So we have the smallest detectable effect size, and so what we then did is looked at the change in the outcome, let's say for hypertrophy, for example, and there's the pairwise comparison table that you can see in the supplementary materials. And for what is the number of per session sets, where if we're comparing that to any greater number of sets, the difference in that outcome has a less to think about this is like that point above which you have a less than 50% chance of having like a real tangible measurable improvement that we can feel really good about, right? It does still continue to increase technically, the model still shows that, but we just have very little confidence. There's a lot of variation. You can see in the figure too, those the green and the blue bands they get wider and wider as you go. That variation gets wider. So that's what we were really trying to define, is this point of where we can't really be super confident that the outcome is better. And so we were brainstorming different acronyms for that mess, and eventually landed on that one.
Awesome. Yeah. So I tell you what, why don't we go ahead and dive into really what everybody's looking for? So basically, just to recap where we're at here, what everyone's interested with these kinds of meta regression projects is On the y-axis, I want some indicator of muscle growth or strength increases. On the x-axis, we're looking at some quantification of per session set volume, whether it's going to be direct or fractional, whatever the case is. And we want to look at what is that relationship between how set volume per session predicts the outcome of interest, either getting bigger or getting stronger. And so if you want to kind of talk us through, we can do hypertrophy first, and then we can do strength after that. And while you're talking, since we're on YouTube live and this is a multimedia experience, I'm actually going to put the figures up there over my face, because why not look at the figures instead of me, especially in my state of disrepair at this hour of the evening. So figure 2 is the green one. You know it well. I'm sure you've been obsessing over it for quite some time. But yeah, I'm going to adjust my screen size here so I can get it up there. And yeah, take it away. Why don't you walk us through the results here?
Sweet. Yeah. So basically, what you're seeing is exactly that, right? Y-axis is the change in muscle size. These are all direct measures of muscle size, by the way. There's no DEXA, there's no bod pod, there's no skin fold estimations, none of that stuff. It's all, MRI, CT scan, ultrasound, so on and so forth. And then on the x-axis is the different per session volumes. And what you are seeing is, as we do more per session volume, that change in muscle size does tend to increase. It does do so in a diminishing manner, right? So clearly, set 1 is the most hypertrophy, right? And then set 2 is still really good, but a little bit less than set 1, and so on and so forth. And it kind of, it curves upwards, and it starts to be, eventually starts to look more and more asymptotic as you go. And that PUOS, as we said, where we can no longer have a ton of confidence that it's actually measurably better above that number, right around 11 fractional sets in a session. And then on the right side of the figure, I'm visualizing in my head because I don't have it pulled up in front of me, that's just showing that in general the dose response is positive, basically, right? That's showing like the point estimate of the slope, which would be the change in hypertrophy, at the mean per session volume. And because it's on the right side of 0, it's positive. So in general, positive slope. So increasing hypertrophy with increasing per session sets, but really gets iffy up above that 11 or so fractional sets.
So in practical terms, that 11 number represents what to you?
That's so this is when we start crossing into practical recommendations rather than just what the data say, right?
Yeah.
I have been thinking about this a lot the last couple of days because I'm seeing a lot of the conversation online about it, and I think it's really important that the figure is the model that you're seeing in the figure is describing the data, and that's all it's doing. And then we need to take that and interpret it through the filter of practical experience, coaching experience, training experience, whatever, to actually make a recommendation. So for me, when I look at this, I think clearly you can make awesome gains with really low per session volumes. You don't have to go super high. And then as you get higher and higher, you need to start making a decision about, like, is this really worth it? And I think that 11 point to me is very much so the average person in the average situation, which is what we're looking at here, right? Once you get up to around that 10, 11-ish sets in a session, fractional, it's like, man, I don't know, is this really worth it? Is my performance really good? Is my recovery really good? Does this feel sustainable?
Yeah.
All those kinds of questions, right? Is it really worth putting in this much more effort for a very low chance at a very, very small increase in growth? And for some people it is, right? For some people there's a bunch of people where that's worth it. They want to err on the side of doing more. For a bunch of people, it's not super worth it, right? So I think both sides, that's the other thing I'm talking for forever right now, but that's the other thing that I've been thinking about a lot yesterday and today is, like, I feel like this really supports a huge range of approaches, right? There's the time efficient approach, there's the win at all costs approach, there's the err on the side of more. Like, it really, you can make a strong argument for anything, I think.
Yeah, and I think what's interesting about it is that that 11 number puts you, I would say, conveniently as a content creator, it puts you right in the fun part, right? So it's not like every training program you come across is going to be on any particular side of that 11 number, right? You're going
Sure.
to have some that are above it, some that are below it by default. So it's one of those things where you can start to actually really have some arguments, right? You know, if you were to go, for example, back at some of the old bodybuilding magazines we talked about earlier, it wouldn't have been unusual to see a chest day that's like, what, 18, 20 sets of chest, right?
For
I
sure.
mean, you would see some of that. I would say the norm for just a pure chest day, I haven't done this, like the 5 day bodybuilding split type training for quite some time, but the norm back then would probably more likely be in the 12 to 16 ish range, I would say, for your, and it would all be direct, for a muscle group like the chest, obviously. But then you start talking about, well, how much would I do per session in a typical full body program? And for your chest, it's probably certainly, I would say, going to be less than 11 sets in that single session. What about if you were doing an upper body lower body split? Still, for your chest, you're probably doing under 11.
Hmm.
Then it starts getting a little more interesting when you get into training splits like push pull legs. For a push workout, are you doing 11? I don't know. I would typically do, if I were doing a push workout for chest, being the kind of first muscle group I hit in a push workout, I probably would typically be somewhere in the range of 9 to 12, right? Which is, where things start to get interesting. So
Hmm.
I think that this is super convenient that it falls in a spot where you start to see some very common splits below it, some very common splits above it, and of
Yeah.
course, everyone can yell at each other and get very angry. Now, before we get into the practical, I want to save some of that for after we at least look at the strength results and things like that. But one of the things that jumped out to me in this figure, and I'm purely, this is not a statistically oriented set of observations here. This is just a guy looking at fuzzy dots and a few squiggly lines. So one of the things that really struck me was just the magnitude, the sheer degree of variance within the data, right? So we see these these dotted intervals that are really, there's a lot of land between
Yeah.
upper and lower boundary of the interval. We see, for example, that I believe the highest Y value in the entire data set is at a per set volume, or a per session set volume value of about three ish, 3 or 4. So, kind of at the lower end. And then we see the kind of outlier in terms of the greatest per session set volume actually has a value on the y axis that's essentially zero.
Yeah.
So it and of course you never, being statistically oriented, you never just shop around and cherry pick this data point versus that data point. But I do think that those two data points at least speak, of course, then within the context of those wide intervals that we see, reflecting the general confidence level of the estimate. It just really speaks to the fact that there's a lot of room in here for contextualizing the findings. And it's not as simple as saying, oh, you're only doing 8 sets per session, you need to bump that up to 11, you'll grow more. Right? Like
Right.
it'd be really hard to make that statement without any other context and just throw it out there and have a high level of confidence in it. So I guess one of my questions is, were you surprised by all that real estate between the upper and lower interval? And to what would you speculate? To what would you attribute that? Either with a high level of confidence, or even if you're just speculating. Like, why do you think there's so much variance when we're looking at this relationship between these two variables?
Yeah, man, that's a great question. I think the The thing that jumps out to me the most, and I've been thinking about this a lot, and I still don't have a great explanation. It makes a lot of sense for lower per session volume and higher frequency to be better. But we never, like, the frequency data just doesn't reflect that, right? Like just our meta-regressions recently, there was
Yeah.
no strong, consistent effective frequency for hypertrophy, and it's like, well, why didn't we see 30 sets per session as the best then, right?
Yeah.
Um, and I guess you can sort of combine the two papers in a way and say 10 to 11 sets 3 times a week gets you to that 30-ish number and whatever. But when you look at the diminishing returns, I think there's a very valid argument for like, well, like why doesn't this work out? Um, so to me, like I think there is something there, and maybe that's why some of that variation is so big. Like it's just we're not quite capturing reality perfectly yet,
Right.
which is just the eternal. Oh, we need more data or whatever, right? But I was thinking about this a lot, and the average per session volume in the data set was, I believe, around 6 or so sets per session. I wrote that down somewhere, um, but I don't know where it is. Anyway, I
Yeah.
think it was right around 6, and it's like, well, maybe that's still sort of too high to see this consistent effect really start to manifest. So, I would love more data at those lower per session volumes compared to, especially like the really high above 11 and seeing what's up because there's just not a ton of data points out. It's just like the weekly volume, right? There's just not a
Yeah.
ton of these super high volume studies that maybe that even pulls that curve down more and we see the PUOS is lower, whatever. So
Yeah.
anyway,
Now that you mention it, especially anyone watching on YouTube right now can really see a lot of clustering in that kind of what I would call a pretty moderate range, so a lot of stuff in that 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 range.
hmm
But yeah, you start getting above maybe 10-ish, and it really
yep,
starts to thin out there. And so obviously we have to be super cautious about kind of, modeling like this. Sometimes you can turn it into a not the person actually doing statistics because there's literal math happening, but as the passive observer, you can start putting things together like when you're looking up at the night sky and kind of drawing out constellations,
hmm
and say like, yeah, I think that looks like a roaring lion, and then the
sure,
person next to you said, oh, I thought that was a ladle.
yeah,
But yeah, so it's like these kind of these kind of figures, especially in the areas where the data start to become very sparse. You got to have to kind of you have to work against human evolution and stop being a species that exists on pattern recognition. We
hmm
really love to connect dots, whether or
yeah,
not they ought to be connected. But yeah, it's a really fascinating relationship that you guys plot out here, and like you said, I'd love to see more studies that kind of fill in that upper range, just as I'd like to see that with the per week
yeah,
set volume, where it will be so interesting to see, are we really talking about you know a we fit this kind of log linear model. We start to see where things are really flattening out, where they're starting to get almost asymptotic, approaching a horizontal straight line.
hmm
When you fill in more in the upper range, does that curve take a slightly different shape? Do we start to see a little bit of a adjustment of where things really start to flatten out? Do we maybe even start to see more of a more of a quadratic shape where we start to see if you're doing way too much, it actually starts bending back down towards zero. Where the effect size actually starts shrinking rather than merely diminishing. So many questions, and ultimately, Jake, you know this as well as anybody, but your guys' lab has done such a great job with these meta regression projects. But all due respect, it'd be worthless if people weren't out here running the studies, right? And so one of the conclusions when you come back from a big meta regression project like this is you look at your beautiful figures and you look for empty space and you say, hey, somebody's got to fill this in, right?
uh-huh. What's funny? We, we talked for probably 2 hours one day about what study could we do that would help to like look at this per session volume frequency thing a little bit, like very directly, right? Rather than just getting a bunch more data points. And it's so hard to isolate per session volume from frequency.
Right.
And it gets out of control really quick. I mean, we had this. It was like, okay, we need four groups. Oh wait, no, we need six. Actually, four might be like we just. It was so messy and disgusting that these individual studies are they're very important, but some of them are just really impractical, and we wind up being we just need all of the individual studies. Unfortunately, with how much manpower would have to go into something that complex.
Yeah.
But yeah. Oh,
And
and the
then,
other
I
thing.
mean, and you guys obviously, your lab has worked with James Steele, and he was on the
Yeah.
show recently. And once you start saying, okay, we're going to do this study, and the measurement, the outcome is measured imperfectly, as they all are, but there's going to be measurement error involved. And in order for us to have those 6 groups that allow us to actually test the hypothesis, now we're talking about maybe you finish the study with like 8 people per group.
Right.
And then at that point you say, well, what are we actually estimating? Like
Yeah.
are we really, do we have any confidence at all that when you get through measurement error and sampling error that we are testing any hypothesis at all,
Yeah.
in a meaningful way? And I think James, to the extent that he was able to drag people into the abyss of despair and black pilledness,
Yes.
would
He's
convince
good
you,
at
like,
that.
it's almost hard to work up the energy and allocate the resources to put a study like that together and then come out with it. And everyone's first response is going to be, I'm not sure if you're actually estimating something worthwhile here. And then deep down they're kind of right.
Yeah.
Kind of hard to sink a big chunk of your life into that for 6 to 12 months.
It is. It is.
All right, Jake. So let's go ahead and let's move on and look at the strength results, if you don't mind, and then we can kind of really break open into a kind of sweeping discussion of practical applications. Because, like, for me, this is where things start to get interesting because we now have the meta regression on, we have proximity to failure, we have volume per week, we have frequency per week, and now we have volume per session. Now you can start getting into, by piecing all that together, some really interesting discussions and debates about actual training programs. Like, it's very different from looking at them in isolation when we can start to look at how all these different puzzle pieces fit together, and start making some inferences. So I've got the figure up here, this beautiful purple figure, where on the y-axis we have change in strength, maximal strength in this case, and on the x-axis we have set volume per session.
Yes. I'm glad you pointed out maximal strength because this is this the strength. It's really funny because the strength data does, you know, it's interesting, it's cool, but I think there's a one of the limitations that I put at the end that I don't think is I haven't heard anybody talk about it,
Yeah.
which is like I said earlier, the model is going to describe the underlying data, right? So the data are what they are, and the outcomes being maximal strength, whether it's isometric or whatever, one arm squat, whatever it was. But when you look at the actual training programs, the average rep range that was done in these studies for just the strength outcomes was like 9, and the I think on average it was like 2 sets a week or 2 sets a session, maybe. I think it was 2 sets a session. That was hold on, I wrote this number down so I don't screw this up live with all the pressure. Yeah, so 2 sets per session were done on average. About half of those were done with something that was what most like powerlifters would train with, right? Like
Yeah.
there was hardly anything above 85% 1RM, hardly anything that was above like a 6 rep max load. Very unspecific training
Yeah.
in general, right? So I think people should keep that in mind when they look at the strength data. That it is what it is. It's the best we got right now,
Yeah.
but like there's something to be desired with the specificity of the training. Um, Nonetheless, we did find the very similar relationship to the weekly one. Does increase. It is a positive slope on average. More per session volume is better for strength. but it tapers off quite quickly. And that point of undetectable outcome superiority that we were looking at, right around 2 direct sets per session in this case.
Okay. Yeah, and this was one where when I first looked at the figure, I became very confused because I think my brain was just really conditioned at the idea of fractional set counting. And
Yeah.
so then you look at this figure and you see not only is there a lot of clustering in terms of just the frequency of a given, amount of per session set volume, but it looks like a lot of the clustering is at zero. And I was like, what do you mean you're doing 0 sets and you're still bothering to measure muscle strength? But I'm assuming that basically what we're talking about there is muscles that only got indirect training through the training program as it was put together, right?
100%.
Yeah,
100%.
so they had
That's
some fractional sets,
yeah.
presumably, but in terms of direct sets, they just weren't getting any love.
Correct. Yeah,
Yeah.
correct. The direct we tried to look at also like what was the rough contribution of indirect sets to the outcome, and it was something like it was like 16%, I think.
Yeah.
It was like in theory an indirect set would count as roughly 16% of a full direct set, which I think is also sort of explaining why we saw the direct model fitting the data the best, because the direct model assumes indirect is 0, whereas fractional assumes it's 50%. So it's sort of
Yeah.
16 is closer to 0, right? So yeah, the indirect sets don't do nothing. Clearly, they don't do nothing. Otherwise, we wouldn't have effects at 0, right? But the yeah, biggest bang for your buck does certainly seem to be the direct sets, which makes sense, right? Specificity is something people have been talking about forever.
Right. Now, again, speaking of variance, man, data really quite the spread here. We
Hmm.
see, which makes sense. I mean, just when you think about strength as a variable as opposed to hypertrophy, right? So strength has a lot more variability to it.
Sure.
Even just day to day, right? Let alone over the course of a study. So, not super surprising that we see just generally a little bit more spread there. But, you start to see, I mean, 0 direct sets per session, and then a Y value of 60, right? And the gap between upper and lower boundaries being from plus 25 to minus 15ish, 20ish. Again, just a tremendous amount of variability. And so that's, people might look at that and I think maybe critique the meta regression approach in general. Like people might look at that and say, like, hey, you don't have the goods to actually, have the gall to draw a line between that mess, right?
Yeah.
But you could look at that and you could have, I think, a very spirited and informative debate between two very statistically oriented people where one person says you don't have the goods, like these data aren't ready for prime time, there's no point in drawing a line between that mess. And yet on the other hand, you could have someone who says the fact that we're seeing so much variance, and the relationship is so murky between y and x, that is actually why meta regression is the right approach to try to sort through that stuff. Because if you're just going study by study, you're never gonna get it. Right? Like if you're just doing the kind of thing where you cherry pick and say, well, this amount was better in that study, but this amount was better in that study, therefore we've cracked the
Mhm.
code. You're never gonna get it when the relationship between y and x has this much cloudiness to it. And
Right.
so that's one of the areas where meta regression actually shines, in my opinion.
For sure. Yeah, and like the example you gave, the 0 direct sets that has the super high outcome, like maybe that was one of the untrained subjects with a completely novel strength. You know what I mean? Like
Yeah.
the strength test and all these. There's so many, as you said, variables to strength, like the novelty of the test, like it's pretty rare to see people doing multiple baseline tests to establish a reliable 1RM before they do the
Oh
train
yeah,
program.
for sure.
So maybe pretest was a random high or low day, who knows, right? So yeah, it's very messy, and I think you were sort of getting at this a little bit too. We tried to use some of the tools at our disposal statistically to tease this apart a little bit more, we looked at a bunch of moderators, things that could potentially impact the relationship and all that, and we had this super long list of stuff, and just we can't have super high confidence in really any of it, just because I mean, it's better than nothing, I suppose, but it's just so messy, and there's so much variation, and there's so little homogeneity between study methods. Like, there's just a lot going on. So we even put in the paper, like, we did these. Maybe it's a hypothesis for a future study or something, but like that's really all we mentioned, which was really disappointing to me. Can I just say that? I was really excited to see what's going on. What's, like you mentioned, the meta regression on the proximity to failure stuff. How is this different when you train to failure versus not? You know, like there's so many questions, different training status, like upper body versus lower body. Is lower body more fatiguing? Thus, you need less. Like, there's so much stuff that would make some logical sense based on what we see in the real world, but it just didn't come out of of the models confidently, and so that was a little, you know, a little disappointing. I'm not gonna lie. The data are what they are, but I was hoping it'd at least be interesting.
Yeah, absolutely. So I tell you what, wrapping up the kind of look at the results here, I'm looking at table one. Um, and so it looks like it's called the approximate conversions of PUOS from the best fit model to other volume quantification methods. And so
Mm-hmm.
if we look at the bolded ones are the ones you actually modeled, right? So a fractional sets for hypertrophy and direct sets for strength, right?
Correct. Correct.
So yeah, for total sets, hypertrophy is 13.8 and strength is about 5. For direct, the values are 8 and 2, and for fractional, the values are 11 and about 3.5. And remind me, so direct sets and fractional sets, I think we've hammered out those definitions. Remind me again, total sets, is that where, for example, bench press is 1 set for chest and 1 set for tricep?
Yep.
So a full set for tricep being the
Yep.
distinction there between the total set and the fractional set approach.
Yes.
Cool. Okay, so yeah, I think table one is really a pretty straightforward table that kind of hammers it home.
Mm-hmm.
Where if you're taking the fractional set method, you're saying okay, uh, looking to, and again, this is oversimplifying to a level that's going to make you start sweating, if not shaking in your chair. But if you look at this meta regression, and like many, you're saying, I want it boiled down to where does the where do the diminishing returns diminish to an extent that maybe I don't want to go beyond, and kind of put a whole lot of effort beyond level X. For fractional set counting, which I think a lot of people use as kind of their default set counting, if I had to guess, hypertrophy is at 11 sets per session, and strength is at 3.5. Now, I think this is where the fun stuff starts, and I'm going to go ahead and put my face back on the screen so I can do spit takes and use facial gestures as a means of communication non-verbally.
Perfect.
So now we've got these meta-regressions, right? We've got one about proximity to failure. We've got one about how many sets you should do per week, how you would distribute those in terms of, frequency across the week. Now we have an even more nuanced look at that volume distribution where you're actually looking at sets per training session. And rather than tiptoeing around the practical applications and kind of warming you up and creeping into the deep end, I think I'm just going to do a cannonball here, and say, having been around the lab as these 3 meta-regression projects have come to fruition and now are seeing the light of day, let me ask this. How has it changed your kind of approach to training in terms of how much you aim to do, what kind of training splits or kind of architecture to your training programs do you start to apply? And then a sub question I think would be, how does that impact the way you might program for people throughout the training lifespan? So it's one thing to say how you as a person who's been training for 10, 11 years, maybe more.
Yeah.
It's one thing to ask how you now look at the nuts and bolts and the kind of skeleton of your training program, but also how does that differ when you bring in somebody who's brand new and you start saying, well, let's, go on the lower end of some of these variables versus someone who is, you know, they've been competing for 10 years and they're in their prime and they're trying to achieve their best physique ever.
Yeah, man, that is a cannonball, isn't it? Um, I guess I will start. I'll start with the strength side because I think that's much more simple. That by and large, I think it's fairly reasonable to say at this point, despite the limitations I mentioned earlier, that less is more for strength often. And this is something that I kind of stumbled upon this anyway, just through coaching and noticing like, especially the stronger somebody is, like you just can't do that much, right? You beat them up too much. It's so fatigue sensitive. So it makes sense to me that that's sort of what we're seeing in these meta-regressions now. That you just don't need a ton of work. Sort of get in, do something that's really high value, couple sets, whatever. Even like PAX research on minimum dose stuff lines up with this very nicely, right? I don't think that's a coincidence. So less is more for strength. That's pretty simple. Frequency, it hasn't really changed too much about what I do. Well, I was gonna say with myself, but I don't really train for strength these days. But with clients, you know, usually, twice a week, maybe I guess you could call it 1.5 for the deadlift sometimes, or even the squat sometimes for very strong people. Um, Bench you typically do a little bit more frequency, but it's still right. It's just not crazy crazy volume. Hypertrophy I think is a lot more. There's a lot more stuff going on there, and my sort of trajectory with this has been um, my my confidence level in the dose response of volume is higher than the dose response of proximity to failure, personally, just for me.
Yeah.
Just because, and it's all in the paper too, the proximity to failure, when there was some estimations that went into figuring out how much RIR a certain study was using and things like that. So there's just more data in the volume meta-regressions too. So I have a bit more confidence in that side. So
Yeah, and if I may interject,
yeah,
I just I yeah, I really struggle between looking at the original studies themselves and then just like years of experience with my own training other clients. I just really struggle to get myself to the belief that you're really missing out on much when you leave a rep in the tank. You know what I mean? That
yeah,
you're crossing into some magic threshold when you do that one extra muscle action. It's
yeah.
just it's really really difficult for me empirically and mechanistically to get myself there. So I'm with you on that.
Agreed. I think it would make sense if it's like a little tiny bit better, maybe, right?
Right. Yeah.
But then is that fatigue worth it? Who knows? So to me, the question sort of became like, well, if very simplistically saying more is better for each of them, but they both compete for your recovery resources, which one do I lean into more? What I started doing with myself and with clients is like, okay, well, let's maybe we go a little bit closer to failure on average. Not that everything is to failure, but on average, it's a little bit closer. And how much does that impact how much volume you can recover from? If it's a lot, probably not super worth it. Maybe we back off a little bit, stay a bit further from failure, so we can keep that volume in. If it doesn't impact your recovery that much at all, which in my experience has been most people, not everybody, but I think you do sort of get used to it after a little bit, and we can keep the same volume in a little closer to failure. Sweet. Or you can experiment the other way, right? I think as long as it sounds like we're both in agreement. As long as you're pretty close to failure for the most part, you're going to be fine.
Yeah.
And then what these meta regressions recently on the volume ones have sort of made me even more confident in that. Like, okay, that's sort of the lever I'm looking at the most in terms of let's try a certain amount. What's your performance like? How are you recovering? Do we actually seem like we're growing also, right? Performance and recovery are great, but we need to see some other stuff too. Is it feel sustainable? Do you just hate going to the gym for 3 hours? You only have 30 minutes. Okay, right? So there's a lot of wiggle room there. I think the biggest takeaway that I've gotten to sort of, you know, to sort of wrap it up in a sense, just because there's just so many options on the table that with the per session stuff, if somebody like myself is able to recover from very high volume, I'm going to split it into more frequency. If we start getting up into those 10, 11, 12 fractional sets, I'm like, let's split this up a little bit more, right? That's probably been the biggest change that I've noticed through going through this whole process, which still isn't a massive change. I think most of us do that intuitively anyway,
Yeah.
but now I have more of a reason behind it, if that makes sense.
Yeah. And it kind of also, I think, like you said, it's a bit intuitive because it kind of matches what you feel, and also just
Yeah.
just the tediousness of it kind of keeps you in check a little bit. So, for example, let's say you are going to follow the guidance of like, hey, I'm not super worried about efficiency. I want to get all the gains that are on the table. I'm going to do really high weekly set volume. If you want, you can try to squeeze that into a session or two sessions for that muscle group. Um, but you can feel toward the end of a workout, you're like, I'm just,
Yeah.
I am so, as a vegetarian, I'm allowed to say this because I have enough karma built up. I am so beating a dead horse here. Like, I'm, when you're at the point where you're just like, what am I doing here? My performance has dropped off so much from where I began in this session. Like,
Yeah.
whether or not you can, craft a meta-regression to quantify what junk volume is, I'm in the garbage dump and I know it, right? Like, I have to be. Um,
100%.
because I know how strong I am and I know what I'm doing right now, and I can't get myself to believe it's as stimulatory as the
Yeah.
stuff I was doing 45 minutes ago, right?
Right. Or even have you had it where like you're training, you get a pump, whatever, and then the pump goes away and you just feel like numb? Like
Yeah,
that can't be good, right? I don't, there's no
yeah.
reason, but it just can't be good. I don't know.
Yeah, you've already been through the life cycle of like you pumped up and you flattened out, your
Yeah.
performance is tanked, and you're just like, I got to get out of here, right? So
Yeah.
that's one of the constraints that I think practically helps people intuit. There's got to be a better way to split this up. And then of course another thing is just like you it's very a lot of people that I've coached, and certainly myself as well, we like to turn our daily workouts into a repeatable behavior that is fairly consistent, and it gets really weird. So like, for example, I teach a weight training class right now. It's one of my teaching assignments here at Duke, and I was kind of given an option. Would you rather do, it's like we meet twice a week, would you rather do one lecture a week and have like a really short workout that day and a longer workout the other day, or would you rather lecture for an equal amount of time twice a week so that training block stays the same on Monday and
Yeah.
Wednesday? And I was like, well, my life is easier if I just teach once a week, get into the flow of it, and go with it. But like, the class is not for me, it's for the students. And it would drive me nuts if I had this kind of offset. On Monday I work out for 45 minutes and then on Wednesday I work out for 75 minutes.
Yeah.
It's like you have to have such a different approach to those two different workouts. And so like, if you want to do this ultra high weekly set volume approach and not end up erring toward higher frequency, you get into this weird thing where you're like, okay, so Monday, Wednesday, and Friday morning I'm in the gym for like 95 minutes, but then
Hmm.
what am I doing with that time on like Tuesday and Thursday? It just creates this weird asymmetry in your day
Yep.
that, I think also acts as a practical constraint where a lot of people are like, I just want to have my hour or hour and a half in the gym at the same time every day that I can count on and make it part of my routine. You know what I'm saying?
Absolutely. Absolutely. And like also, I don't want people to hear higher frequency and think it has to be you're training your chest 5 times. Like
Right.
it just maybe just don't do one. You know what I mean?
Yeah. Yeah.
Or think about even most people when we think about frequency. I think not certainly not everybody, but the majority twice a week is like their standard, right?
Yeah.
That what's wrong with three, right? Like you might notice with your chest, for example, you can train it 3 times. Like the soreness isn't going to overlap that much, and you can do some things with like exercise selection, for example, where if you're training 3 times a week, one of those is going to have 2 rest days later, right? So maybe on that session, that's where you put your chest flies that are going to create more muscle damage from that lengthened position, and so on and so forth. The other days maybe it's slightly less per session volume or slightly further from failure, or whatever. You can sort of manipulate the recovery in those other ways to still keep the volume in, which I think makes sense because the volume is probably the variable I have the most confidence in personally.
Yeah.
So those are some of those programming, like when you, the research is not going to ever tell us how to do that. It's so much of it is just, I don't know, like reasoning, and what sort of makes sense. So,
Yeah. One of the things I like about your answer when I just did that cannonball like a bull in a china shop and said, here's a question of how should people train essentially go.
yeah.
Um, I like the fact that you took a deep breath and essentially said, you kind of set the stage of like, this is going to be a somewhat wishy washy and meandering and underwhelming answer.
Yeah.
And that's a good thing. And I think, one of the things that we really have to be cautious of in evidence based fitness is we have to make sure that as researchers, as people consuming research, as people making content about research, and as people just sharing information broadly, we have to remember to maintain a high level of nuance in the way that we interpret and then disseminate that information from research. So, what I'm getting at there is I am sure that someone out there in this world, the world that you and I share with them, believe it or not, is out there going, well, we know because of meta-regression that this is the perfect weekly set volume, and this is the perfect frequency, and this is now the perfect set volume per session. And therefore, through 3 projects from the Zordos lab, we have solved training.
I
Training is now
wish.
a solved question, and we can move on to nobler pursuits
Yeah.
of art, studying history, maybe get into music, whatever. But exercise science research in resistance training is done.
It's
And,
done.
and I like the fact that you would not even entertain drifting near such a kind of superficial and simplistic, just bam, 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 here's the answers. Everyone lock into the evidence based training program, trademark 1999.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I thought about that it's just 3 sets of 10, right? I mean, that's the real answer. So I thought
Right.
about leading with that, but then I was like, we should probably try to sound smarter than that, I suppose.
Yeah.
But
But so
it's
for the
right. Like
person
there is
who,
just no correct answer.
yeah, for the person who wants to interpret it that way, what is your kind of 60-second sales pitch of here's how we ought to actually use these rather than a literal roadmap to gains?
Yeah. I would look at just the nature of the relationship, right? So like the per session volume, for example, on average increases hypertrophy with more per session volume, but with less and less with every additional set. If we keep that in mind, I think that can guide a lot of our decision making. If we don't have a ton of time, that's fine. We're getting the biggest bang for our buck anyway. It diminishes so much, right? So rather than thinking about the numbers, thinking about the general magnitude, the general direction of the relationship, and letting that, like Dr. Zordas says all the time, conceptualize and integrate, right? That's like
Yeah.
it's such a great teaching tool. I think that applies here very well. That if we think about just the concept, then we can apply that to whatever we're doing.
Yeah. Yeah, it's a great answer. And I think a lot of folks, you've been lifting for 10 years, 11 years, somewhere around there. You're in that world now where you create your own programming, right?
Yeah.
Or you create it for other people, right? But for a long time before you're a program creator, you are a program consumer, right? You'll go and
Mm-hmm.
Google want to get big, how do, and then something
Yeah.
comes up. And you're looking at these 3 different programs, and they all have testimonials of jacked people saying, this is what made me jacked. Don't do anything else. And so I think these types of meta regressions, like you said, they can give you these kind of uh, directional relationships. You start to get approximations of different ranges that you might want to operate within. And so then you can look at these 2 different programs you're contemplating and say, well, I'm into strength, and this one seems a lot more compatible with the type of ranges I'm used to seeing in these different variables, right? The types of
Mm-hmm.
ranges that seem to be in the neighborhood of sweet spots. versus I'm more into hypertrophy. So I think I'm going to go with program B instead because it's hitting all these numbers that seem to be a little bit more compatible with, again, the ballpark values and directional relationships we're seeing in some of these meta-regressions. So I think that once people get over the disappointment that we haven't solved training conclusively, they can at least look to those insights with optimism and kind of appreciate the utility that we can glean from that.
Yeah.
One kind of final line of questioning here, if I may,
Sure.
is so this when did this get posted to the preprint server?
Ooh,
Like a week
last
ago?
week sometime? Yeah. I think it's been less than a week.
Yeah.
Somewhere
So
in there.
what what kind of feedback have you been getting, and what would you say is the single flavor of feedback that you most want to nip in the bud and put to rest before it before it takes over the internet?
Uh, there's been good conversation. I think there's been very, very, very good points made. Um, I think we already sort of nipped the biggest one in the bud, which is that you should do 11 sets per workout no matter what.
Yeah.
Um, that we've talked about that plenty. I think that the two main things that I've seen that unfortunately the answer is like we just don't really know, right? One being the like, hey, 11 is less than 30. Why are we not seeing this effective frequency? And like we talked about earlier, we just, we talked about that. I don't need to rehash it. I think that's the big one that just like, I understand it doesn't make perfect logical sense. I get it. The data are what they are, but like that doesn't mean that you can't do less than 11 sets, right? There's a lot of
Yeah.
options on the table. I think the other one, very, very valid concern being this idea of like these high volumes are leading to more growth because it's a lot of swelling, a lot of edema.
Yeah.
Um, very valid, right? I totally get it. Two, this is one of the limitations that's listed in the paper that we were able to find a few studies that looked at this a little bit, and it doesn't seem to be a massive concern, but that doesn't rule it out completely, right? So the research that we have is not much, and it's not looking at the question exactly how we would like, right? So like there's a couple of cute studies that they just had people do super high volume programs that create a lot of muscle damage, a lot of swelling, and they saw like roughly how many days did it take for it to kind of come back down, and both of those we're seeing like a day or two after the session. We're no longer significantly different from baseline muscle size. So it's like, okay, maybe that's fine, but that's acute swelling. It's not necessarily chronic swelling from a long program. Um, you could argue that maybe they were still a little bit swollen from their previous training program before they started the study. It wasn't super clear in my reading, like how long they had waited before they did this acute study. So, could go either way. And then there was one that Martin Ruffalo did, was the lead author, where they took their measurements 3 days after the last training program, cool, and then did another measurement 2 or 3 days after. And they found very little error. It was really, really good agreement between those measurements. So it's like, okay, cool, maybe 3 days is fine. But then you could also say, well, maybe it's still an issue 5 or 6 days later, right? So you can make an argument either way. We don't really know for sure. I personally would tend to think that it's probably not a massive deal, but I could be wrong, right? So I think that's another big thing that I'm not going to take a super hard stance on it either way, but I think that also means that I'm not going to say these results are absolutely due to swelling, just like I'm not going to say they're absolutely not due to swelling. I would hazard to guess that that's not a huge contributor, although I'm sure it contributes some. But yeah, I guess I would throw that out there just to kind of let that be what it is, taking the middle ground as always. It depends, right?
Yeah.
So, yeah.
Absolutely. And have you generally been pleased with some of the discourse and discussion?
Yeah, I mean, some of it's funny. Some people will troll just to troll,
Yeah.
and that's fun. But I
What's the
think in
most
general,
common trolling tactic that you're seeing these days? What are they going
um,
with?
there's been some just like people just put like yeah, no, or like something just clear cut like that, which fine, fair play.
Yeah.
Um, or if only it wasn't all swelling, or
Yeah.
somebody mentioned that we can't just put a trend line wherever we want on the graph and say that it means something, which was really fun. Which
Yeah.
is true, you know. But
Yeah.
so there's been some comments like that, but for the most part, people are have been really interested and able to have conversation, going back and forth of getting a little bit more context, which is especially nice when you can see that they've read the full paper. You know, they didn't just look at the figure. That's pretty helpful.
Yeah. Yeah. For what it's worth, I do think for some reason that that particular line of like everything we see in every paper is pure swelling.
Hmm.
I don't pay enough attention to fitness content creation to know where it's coming from.
I don't either, to
But
be
I think
honest.
somewhere in that game of telephone, people are getting it way wrong because
Hmm.
I've seen that popping up in evidence-based conversations, and clearly people are getting it from some like centralized source, and it seems that it's being dramatically overstated, or if it's not being overstated, it's being overheard. You know what I
Ah,
mean? Like
sure, sure.
whatever that amplification is, where you make a very nuanced small point and then it becomes something that's well out of your control.
Yeah.
That may be what's happening, but I don't I don't understand why people have become so convinced that like virtually all growth that we observe with training is swelling. I don't, and yet they train daily. It's like if you really believe what
Yeah,
you're
I mean,
saying, like you should just stop.
yeah, because the low. What's interesting to me too is like the low volume approach typically involves going to failure or past failure, which like that's gonna give you a lot of swelling.
Yeah.
So um, I don't know where it came from. I would assume that it's kind of gotten blown out of proportion, but I don't know for sure either. But
One of these days, you know what? If you so I'm too happy a guy. I'm too well adjusted. Life's too good to get drug into this pettiness. But someone who's really into this stuff should just calculate out like whatever this exaggerated magnitude of swelling is that people think is explaining all growth in studies. Just kind of calculate out if we extrapolate that over a full body program, you must be walking around as like a giant water balloon at that point, right? So what would be the magnitude of weight loss we would predict if you just stopped training for 6 days? And secondary question, does that at all reflect the reality you live in? And
yeah,
I don't know the answer to the first question, but I know the answer to the second one. It's no, right?
right.
So like
Good point.
I don't understand why people think if it's a bicep study, we can assume that all growth, like there's just this massive water balloon in people's biceps that is filling up with inflammatory crap, which is, you know, because it's not just gas,
Yeah.
right? There has to be some kind of fluid volume that's actually causing this expansion of the tissue. And I haven't thought through this well, and it's not good to kind of verbalize your thinking process on live podcasts, but here we are anyway. But I feel like you could kind of shut that whole thing down by doing a fairly simple calculation of like what would happen if a person who trains their whole body, which is the resistance training population, like where does all that go when you just don't train for 5 or 6 days? You know what I'm saying?
Yeah. 100%. That's a
You can
great
tell
point.
me I'm way off base
Yeah.
if I'm oversimplifying or
No.
missing the magical piece of the puzzle here that makes me stupid, but
No, that makes
it's
sense to me. I'll tell you what, I can make an Instagram post and I'll take the bullet, right? So either I will be just vaulted into the upper echelon of evidence-based content creators, or I will be absolutely eviscerated for being an idiot. One
cool.
of the two will happen.
Yeah, I'll wait
So,
for the dust to settle and see if I want to try to take
cool.
credit. But now I've
Sounds
got the
fun.
receipts if I ever want to go that route, and I have the YouTube login. So if this episode gets buried in the vault, it's just because I speculated incorrectly.
That's fair. That's fair.
All right. Well, the final question here. Well, second to final question. As we approach the 90-minute mark here, it's been a really lovely chat. I'm certain that people listening have gotten a lot out of it, practically speaking. Um, is there anything else that you would like to get off your chest about this paper or set the record straight? Anything that you'd like to close with as it pertains to kind of communicating this paper out to the iron culture?
Wow, yeah. I think we've hit on all the big stuff. I think if there's one sort of even bigger picture thing that I sort of alluded to this earlier too at the very beginning, this process has been so illuminating for me of actually doing one of these things and seeing, we come into this research world and, or not even that, we come to the evidence-based fitness world and we hear about the hierarchy of evidence and meta-analysis is up at the top. And, so me, whatever, 7, 8, 9, 10 years ago was like, okay, these are perfect, right? They're as close to perfect as we can get anyway.
Yeah.
And I didn't realize how many completely arbitrary decisions go into these things that can, it's probably not going to be a night and day difference in the results, but it can shift things a little bit here and there. And there's just a lot of that stuff. So like that was eye opening. That has made me a bit more cautious with even this top tier of evidence, and then also in a similar vein, just the idea of really now, like I knew it, but I didn't like know it, if that makes sense, until now that these describe the data. It's not that's all it's doing, right?
Yeah.
So the data that goes in, like that is what controls what the output is, and it's really important to look into that, right? If it's something you're trying to implement with what you do in your training or in your life and in whatever way. So I think that's been the biggest thing that I would maybe throw out there is just like, for anyone who is trying to use research to help guide what they're doing with themselves or clients or whatever, make sure to, even with meta-analysis, unless you've also seen Dr. Trexler completely redo them for mass articles, which is always funny, just keep in mind they're not perfect, right? And there's always limitations, and it's just describing the previous research, and that's it. And then you got to interpret from there.
Beautiful. Yeah, I totally agree, and I will protect you. I will put out a shield. So you said there's all these arbitrary decisions in a meta-analysis, and I totally know what you mean. I just want to put a little caveat again. We're putting up the Iron Culture shield to protect you from the haters and the losers and the low quality people out there who want to attack you. So each decision itself is non-arbitrary, right? You go into it and you say based on theory or
Sure.
methodological considerations or norms or best practices or whatever, we
Sure.
could go left or right at this fork in the road, and we are going to go right this time. But then you run into another one, and again, based on theory or practice or norms or whatever the case is, this time you reach the fork in the road and you say we will go left, and you navigate through a long series of decisions. None of the individual decisions are arbitrary, but you get the overwhelming sense as the person making them that at the end of the road, you almost, if you didn't write them down, it'd be hard to track your way back, right? And you start to
Right.
wonder, what are the multitudes of paths we could have taken
Yep.
defensively? And what you find is that the answer is more than a couple, right? You could have gone left, right, 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 left, left, right, or fill in any number of combinations, and they all would have been defensible.
Sure.
And so the way that I would bolster your point and agree with you is that when you get to the end of it, you say, I just made 20 non-arbitrary sets of decisions that each had a tangible, like a substantial or at least substantive impact on how we got from beginning to end.
Hmm.
And when I look back at this unique combination of 20 decisions in a sequence, that feels arbitrary because I could have just as easily had, multiple other trajectories that would have taken us to a slightly different path, and they would have been completely defensible. So the cumulative impact of the path that you wove there does start to get that arbitrary feeling, because you look back and you say, can I necessarily say this path is unequivocally better than some other fabricated path I could reconstruct from that whole meandering set of decisions?
Sure.
And the answer is uncomfortably more often than not no. I cannot conclusively say this is the best path that we could have taken. And so I totally agree with you that once you start to put it all together and say, well, Why did we do this set of 20 answers instead of this very similar set of 20 answers or that one? That's where you start to feel like it does feel kind of arbitrary. And you, of course, as a meta-analyst, you can observe and you can feel the big ones, right? Like the really, really big ones. And so at least we can help ourselves sleep at night because we can go back and do our trusty sensitivity analyses and say, okay, we knew that that was a big fork in the road, right? So if we had gone left instead of right, would we have found a fundamentally different set of answers or estimates in this meta-analysis? We can go and check that. And we can, calm ourselves down from thinking that we made some dumb decision that altered the trajectory of history as it comes to this meta-analysis. But no, I totally agree with your point. And much like yourself, the first time I did a meta-analysis, I went into it, and I keep using this language because it's really kind of how I felt the first time through. Well, that's not true. That's not true. I took a class on meta-analysis before I did my first one. When I was entering the class, I thought I was entering a class that was, this is how we are going to learn to unequivocally solve blank. So I facetiously said, you guys solved training. It's a solved question. We can set our sights on other things. I really did have that kind of intuitive sense that meta-analyses are functionally how you achieve the resolution to a research topic and question at hand. And much like you observed, once I took that class and then did one of my own, you start to realize, oh, we're all just working toward the most defensible estimate we can produce based on whatever data we have available. And a little fun fact from history is that the first ever meta-analysis, I mean, you could get really creative in kind of deciding what you consider a like rudimentary meta-analysis, but what is widely agreed to be the first kind of modern approach or modern attempt at a meta-analysis was undertaken by Carl Pearson, and it was related to a question about whether or not the British Army should pursue the use of a vaccine for its soldiers, and essentially getting to the punchline of the story, he said, you know what, I'm going to do this thing, and it's going to pretty much lay the theory for what meta-analysis is, and it's going to give us our rock solid, can't miss answer. And he was wrong. So it really kills me kind of from a historical perspective that nowadays we think of meta-analyses as these like can't miss endeavors that find their way toward the universally true answer that the human mind couldn't work to on its own. And ultimately the foundation of it was taking a swing and getting a big whiff and not being able to tell if the vaccine worked or not. So it's a little funny trip down the historical track there. All right. Now I'm just like a 90-year-old man reminiscing about funny statistician stories. So it's time to cut the episode. Jake, thanks so much for joining us. It was absolutely a pleasure. I've done plenty of self-promotion. So now I want to ask you, if people want to stay up to date with what you're doing, where can they find you and heckle you about your future research papers?
Yeah, bring on the heckling. I'm here for it. I guess probably Instagram is the easiest place. It's just at jake.remmert_coach. Nice and easy to remember.
Yeah.
Right? So there's that, or I got a website, jakeremmert.com. That one's much easier to remember. But yeah, that's probably the easiest place. That's kind of where everything goes. And thank you so much for having me on. This is super fun. This is awesome. And like I said earlier, a huge honor to do this. Full circle moment. Always
Absolutely. Cool. Well, it was an honor to have you. Really, really great work on this paper. I thought it was fantastic work, and I think you guys are doing a tremendous job down there in the heat. I don't know how you can think straight with the humidity, but keep it up. You guys are killing it. So awesome work. Thanks for being on, and hopefully we'll have you back on very soon. Folks, as always, thanks for supporting the show. I hope you enjoyed it, and we will see you back with another episode of Iron Culture in approximately 1 week.